think, one of the important things to point out as we go into the criminal justice system is that when I talk about these experiences of marginalization and of poverty, like it's important to recognize that our Black populations, our Indigenous populations, our other racialized populations are hugely heterogeneous. I don't want to leave any viewers or readers leaving thinking that every Indigenous, every racialized, every Black person exists in poverty and is marginalized. That's not the case, but there's certainly an overrepresentation. And the same goes, and I think I say this importantly, with respect to the relationships with both crime and criminal justice. So, just connecting back to the point I raised about being more likely to live in impoverished neighborhoods, also more likely to live in impoverished neighborhoods that are afflicted by the types of crime and disorder that are more likely to come to the attention of the police. So not living in neighborhoods where a large number of people are engaged, for example, in sophisticated fraud or financial crimes that should come to the attention of the police because they cause a lot of devastation and damage to our society and our economic systems. But the types of street-based crime, street-based prostitution, drug dealing, certain types of violence that the police pay a lot of attention to. So we know and we've seen, across this country where the data has come out that Black people, Indigenous people, to an extent, South Asian people are overrepresented in police stop and search practices. So more likely to be stopped, more likely to be searched, more likely to be questioned and carded. And, this is true not only for a small segment of the population who is engaged in kind of criminal or delinquent behavior, but for huge portions of those populations who are not engaged in those activities and who just happen to simply look a certain way or live in certain areas or neighborhoods, or not live in certain areas or neighborhoods. Actually, we see the greatest overrepresentation in police stop and search practices for Black people in Toronto, for example, in affluent, predominantly white neighborhoods where they're seen as out of place. So we have the experience of disproportionate police stop and search. My own research has demonstrated that, when you control for important factors, taking into account, for example, self-reported criminal behavior, the racial disparities in stop and search do not go away. And so we can see bias, various forms of bias is driving those. What are some of those forms of bias? We talked a little bit earlier about, the views of Black and the views of Indigenous people as of being, inferior, part of the racialization. So the process of defining Black people as Black, Indigenous people as Indigenous, has been an association of those populations with crime, with violence, with dangerousness. This goes right back to the process of colonization and the way in which these groups were seen as savages. And that was a term that was often used, right? Posing a danger to white people, especially to white women. So some of those views persist, both consciously and unconsciously, in the minds of police officers, justice officials, and members of the general public. And so these views justify, not only disproportionate rates, seemingly justify or are used to prompt racially disproportionate rates of stop and search, but also treatment during stop and search. So Black people are more likely to say that they were treated poorly during their interactions by the police, less likely to be told the reason for the stop, less likely to be treated with respect, more likely to feel that the officer was rude, and more likely to feel upset by their encounter, for example. So the nature of their treatment is different. When we look at, an example I always like to use in the context of stop and search and getting into arrest, for example, is cannabis. So we know that cannabis is a substance that's used relatively similarly across different racial groups in the Canadian and North American context. So with a few exceptions, for example, for mixed race youth, Black, white, Asian, South Asian people at least Black and white people use cannabis at relatively similar rates. But when we look at the differences in rates of arrests for those crimes, we see a very different picture, right? And so I like to talk about cannabis as a gateway drug, not as a gateway to harder drug use, as it's often thought of, but as a gateway into the criminal justice system for our marginalized populations. And so we see stop and search practices, arrests for things like cannabis possession, increasing the criminalization of Black people. There's a report recently released by the Ontario Human Rights Commission demonstrating that not only were Black people in Toronto more likely to be arrested by the police, but the quality of the arrests laid against Black people by the police were lower than for white people. And we saw that because their charges were much more likely to be dropped or withdrawn by the police or by the Crown, right? So there was less of a valid reason for those arrests to be made in the first place. But irrespective, increased rates of surveillance, disproportionate arrest practices bring Black people into the criminal justice system, we see them overrepresented in pretrial detention, which is important. These are individuals who have not been released while awaiting their trial, so they haven't been, given bail. People who are held in detention before their trial face a number of obstacles, right? They can't demonstrate to the court that they're doing things to mend their ways and to repent, through community service. They can't go into anger management or substance abuse treatment while they're on the outside to demonstrate to a judge that they're, again, trying to mend their ways. They're less able to secure evidence and witnesses that might be beneficial to their trial. Simply being held before trial is likely to increase the chances that you'll plead guilty to simply get out of, this pretrial situation. If you're going to serve a little bit of time and you've already done some, you could end up just walking out the door. So again, increasing the likelihood of criminalization, potentially increasing the likelihood that one would be found guilty, because, if you're seemingly bad enough to be held before your trial, well, surely you've done something wrong. So we see that as well. And then with respect to the courts, unfortunately, we have relatively little information on race and sentencing in the Canadian context. But given what we know about other aspects of Canadian society and the Canadian criminal justice system, I have no reason to believe that, some of the patterns of racial disparities in sentencing that we see in the United States, especially around things like drugs, wouldn't be present here in Canada as well. And, we see that when we look at our correctional systems. Black and Indigenous people being greatly overrepresented in both our federal as well as our provincial correctional systems in this country. And not only are they more likely to be overrepresented in those systems, but they also experience various forms of discrimination behind bars. So less access to programming, less access to jobs, more kind of verbal and physical abuse at the hands of guards. Well, there's one part that I haven't said. So I think something that's important to note, I've talked a lot about bias and discrimination. I think I should also say, in order to be fully balanced, that some of the conditions in which Black and Indigenous people live are conducive to crime as well, right? So there are certain types of crime that Black and Indigenous people may be more likely to participate in as a result of their political, their social, and their economic marginalization. So when we look, for example, at gun homicides in the city of Toronto, we see that young Black men are greatly overrepresented in those homicides. The vast majority of Black men in the city are not engaged in any types of violence. But when we look at that specific crime, we see an overrepresentation. We need to ask ourselves why that is, right? I would argue that there's, that great exclusion from society, the feeling that one does not have a stake in society, and almost that society is out to get you in a way, increases the likelihood that you'll engage in quite reckless behaviors, diminish the value of your life as well as the life of others. There's also evidence to demonstrate, for example, that various forms of discrimination in society, and especially in the justice system, increase the likelihood of engaging in crime. So we see that for young people who have contact with the police early in their life are more likely, all other factors being equal, to actually engage in crime and delinquency than those that don't. So early police contact, and I think it's important as well to note, when we talk about overrepresentation in the justice system, there's long been this polarized debate. Is it bias on the part of the justice system, or is it elevated rates of offending? And I think a sensible answer is that it's both, that the political, the social, the economic marginalization, the society that is structurally and systemically racist in many ways creates conditions that are conducive to certain types of criminal activity for certain subpopulations, increasing, of course, their chances of coming into contact with the police. But so too do those discriminatory police stop and search practices, arrest practices, and other decision-making points in the justice system increase that representation as well. I think first and foremost, we need to look outside the system to prompt change. So we really need to look to our elected and our appointed officials who are responsible for keeping our justice system, our police, our courts, and our correctional systems accountable to the public. So I really look to, from the Prime Minister down to our city councillors who have a voice and can help us keep our police, for example, accountable. But within the system, I think we need a number of different things. I often advocate for the collection of race-based data, and we need that within the criminal justice system, not to tell us that disparities and discrimination exist, but to help us better understand the nature of those disparities and to identify where discrimination does exist. But also, we need that information to be linked to other kind of sectors and other components of our society. So again, we get a better understanding of how those experiences, as we've talked about with child welfare, with education and employment, relate to the justice system too. I think we need to advance the understanding of these issues amongst justice officials, both from the highest levels of the administration down to the frontline workers and staff. And so I think, we need a more fulsome understanding, and I'm seeing that begin to be developed in some areas of the justice system. There are some police agencies that I have contact with that, seem to be beginning to grapple with this in a meaningful way. I would say, something similar is happening in the courts and also in corrections. But importantly, I think there needs to be accountability as well, right? When we look at, it talked about the police laying kind of poor quality charges against Black people, they should be held accountable for that. When the police plant evidence or they lie on the stand or they mislead the courts, they should be held accountable for that. When our correctional officers mistreat people, they should be held accountable for that. The people who develop policies and practices as well that end up having discriminatory outcomes. Carding was used as a performance measure in policing, right? The fact that it was used as a performance measure meant that it ended up being used in a quite discriminatory manner. And so the developers of those policies should also be held accountable for the outcomes that they have.